Day 15. Jake awakened with a start the next morning when Brian knocked on the bedroom door. Brian said, "Breakfast will be ready in about 10 minutes." "Okay," Jake said. Jake was laying on his back and realized Bo was laying on his stomach and was snuggled up next to him. Bo had his right arm draped across Jake's chest. Jake pushed his arm away and told him they needed to get up and get dressed. Bo groggily sat up and flung his feet over the side of the bed and picked up his towel and wrapped it around his waist and headed off to the bathroom while Jeannie followed close behind him. Jake got up and put his sweatpants back on that he wore yesterday. He walked over to his bag and rifled through it and looked for one last clean t-shirt. He found a dark red one that had been shoved all the way down into the bottom of his bag. He fished it out and put it on. He put on a pair of dirty socks and his shoes. He ran the fingers of his left hand through his hair and headed out of the bedroom door to go downstairs. Jeannie sat next to the bathroom door while she waited for Bo, so Jake called her to follow him downstairs. When they reached the bottom of the stairs, Jeannie walked over to the front door and acted like she wanted to go outside, so Jake walked over to the door and let her out and then made his way to the kitchen. Marissa and Brian sat at the kitchen island drinking a cup of coffee. They both said, "Good morning." "Morning," Jake said as he yawned. Marissa asked, "How did you sleep?" "I slept comfortably." Marissa asked, "Would you like a cup of coffee?" "Please." Marissa pointed to 2 cups that sat next to the coffee maker. "Help yourself." Jake walked over to the coffee maker and poured himself a cup of coffee. Marissa said, "Sugar and creamer are over here on the island." Jake walked back over to the kitchen island and splashed a little creamer into his coffee. He noticed Marissa had already put together another care package for them, like she had done yesterday. She asked, "Would you like some breakfast?" "No, thank you. I just normally drink a couple cups of coffee and smoke a few cigarettes for breakfast. I rarely ever eat anything first thing in the morning. Not to be rude or anything, but I'm gonna take my coffee out to the porch so I can smoke." "Okay," Marissa said. Brian said, "I'll join you on the porch in a few minutes. Don't forget to bring all of your dirty laundry downstairs before you leave," Marissa reminded. "I won't forget," Jake said on his way out of the kitchen. He walked through the great room and turned the porch light on before he went outside to join Jeannie and sit down on the porch. He sat down and set his coffee down on the table beside him and then pet Jeannie for a couple of minutes before she laid down at his feet. Boo. Followed Brian outside. They each carried a cup of coffee with them and sat down. Brian also carried his .44 Magnum holstered in his gun belt. Bo wore the same sweatpants he had on yesterday and a dark green t-shirt that Brian had just loaned him. Brian said, "It's just a little after 6 o'clock, and I want to go as soon as we finish our coffee." "I'm ready, but I need to bring my dirty clothes down from upstairs," Jake said. Bo said, "I've already brought my clothes downstairs and left them at the top of the basement steps in the kitchen." Jake finished his cigarette and flicked the butt way out into the yard. He got up and carried his coffee cup back inside, so he could get a refill once he had carried his clothes downstairs and placed them next to Bo's. He walked upstairs and gathered all his dirty clothes together and stuffed everything down inside his duffel bag. He headed back downstairs and walked through the great room and into the kitchen. He opened the door that led to the basement and set his bag down next to Bo's. He walked over to the coffee maker and refilled his cup. He thanked Marissa again, who still sat at the kitchen island. She was eating scrambled eggs and toast. He headed back out to the porch to join Brian and Bo. Once back outside, Jake lit another cigarette while he drank his second cup of coffee. Brian got up and left his .44 on the bench and asked Jeannie to go back in the cabin. He followed her inside and came back out a minute or two later. Jake assumed it was to tell Marissa goodbye. When Brian came back out, he turned the porch light off and closed the front door behind him and asked, "Are you guys ready?" as he carried the cooler and picnic basket. He picked his .44 up from off the bench and walked down the porch steps toward his truck. Jake put his cigarette out like he had done to the first one. "Can I help you carry something?" Brian said, "I can handle it." Jake and Bo stood up and followed Brian out to his Bronco. Brian said, "I want to keep my .44 up front in case we might need it before we get to where we're going to pull off the road." "That's probably a good idea," Bo said. Brian opened the tailgate and stowed the basket and cooler away until later on. He unlocked and opened the driver door and pushed the button to unlock the passenger door. Bo climbed into the back seat and got situated while Jake climbed into the front one. Brian climbed into the driver's seat and handed Jake his .44 and asked, "Will you hold on to this until we get where we're going?" Jake said, "No problem," as he took the gun from Brian and placed it in the floor at his feet. Brian started the engine and turned on the headlights. He put the truck into gear and turned around in the driveway. They traveled about 45 minutes as they zigzagged back and forth while they followed the switchbacks on the road before they finally reached the area where Jake had shot and killed the two creatures last night. "The nightly janitorial crew must have earned triple time last night," Brian said. "I'm referring to the Sasquatch we killed yesterday." "It looks like it," Jake said and chuckled. "I wonder why they didn't mop up all the blood?" Brian and Bo chuckled. They continued on to their destination and parked in an area that Brian had found suitable enough to pull off the road. He pulled up and stopped. He put the Bronco in park and shut off the engine. "Let's go, guys." They climbed out of the vehicle and made their way around to the unlocked tailgate. Jake handed the .44 back to Brian while Bo lowered the tailgate and reached in to get the shotgun and a couple handfuls of 00 buck. Jake pulled the 30-30 out and a couple handfuls of bullets. Brian reached into the back end and also grabbed another handful of bullets for his .44 Magnum and put them in his pocket. Brian closed the tailgate and made sure he locked the truck before they headed off down the game trail that led to Dead Miners Gulch. "The canyon is about 2 miles ahead as the crow flies," Brian said. "Remember to stay alert because the creatures could still be out roaming around." "Don't you worry," Jake said. This trail was not like the others. The brush was thicker most of the way down it. They climbed a small incline and rounded a curve in the trail while they followed Steve's and the Bigfoot's tracks. The tracks vanished when they reached a dense briar thicket. They paused for a few seconds to rest and look for a way to circumnavigate the thicket. Jake examined the area around the thicket, but he didn't find any tracks. The Bigfoot and Steve had either climbed through the thicket itself or had climbed up and over the top of it through the trees. Bo noticed a small opening to the left of the thicket where something had recently crawled through it. He handed the shotgun to Jake and got down on his hands and knees and crawled several feet back into the opening. He shouted, "Once you get through the opening, the thicket opens up to where you can stand up and walk for quite a distance, albeit hunched over." "Hold on," Brian shouted. "Jake and me will crawl through the opening and join you." Since Brian wore his .44 in his gun belt, he took the shotgun from Jake and carried it through the opening and into the thicket while he crawled on his hands and knees. He was careful so he wouldn't get snagged on the briars. Jake got on his hands and knees and followed behind Brian with the 30-30. Bo was right. Once you make it several feet into the thicket, it opens up to where you can stand up and walk. The top of the thicket has grown together though, and that makes it feel like you're walking through a tunnel, Jake thought to himself. Brian said, "This is a good place for bears to make a den. It's also a good place for a Bigfoot to hide out," Jake said and bit his bottom lip. They continued on and walked through the middle of the thicket for about 50 yards before they discovered an exit on the other side that was considerably larger than the opening they had crawled through earlier. The exit was large enough that all they had to do was crouch down to make their way through it. They exited back onto the game trail they had followed previously. A small piece of Steve's shirt lay about 20 feet away from the thicket's exit. "I'm glad to be out of that thicket," Bo said. "It was a little spooky inside there." Brian said, "Yeah, I don't like being inside something I can't see out of." "I don't like that feeling either," Jake said. They continued on down the trail for about another half mile before they had to jump across a little brook. Brian said, "This brook is the brook that flows through the canyon. Why don't we follow it to the canyon?" Jake asked. Bo pointed to Steve's and the Bigfoot's tracks. "We need to follow the tracks. They continue on across the brook toward the canyon. If we follow the brook to the canyon and Steve isn't there, we'll have to waste time to double back here to pick up their trail again." "That makes sense," Jake said. Bo smiled and laughed and said, "You're not much of a tracker, are you?" "No," Jake said and smiled. "I'm really not." They continued to follow Steve's and the Bigfoot's tracks for about 3/4 of a mile and discovered where Steve and the Bigfoot stepped off the game trail and cut diagonally through the woods in the direction of the canyon. "See," I told you, Brian said. The Bigfoot took Steve to the canyon. I guess you're right, Jake said. Good call. We're lucky you remembered the canyon, Bo said. Brian said, I just had a hunch. They stepped off the trail and continued to follow Steve's and the Bigfoot's tracks. Another piece of Steve's shirt lay on the ground ahead. Jake said, Good. At least we know we're headed in the right direction. They continued on until they came to the small brook again. Here, the Bigfoot followed the brook because its footprints were clearly visible along the sodden edge of it. This was the first time they had gotten a good, clear look at the Bigfoot's tracks. The rest of the time, the footprints were usually partial imprints that were left in the leaf litter and forest duff. These prints were firmly planted in the mud with a solid contour, and all of the Bigfoot's toes were visible. Brian put his foot beside one of the Bigfoot's right footprints. He whistled and said, This one's a big boy. They compared the print to Brian's size, 12 shoe, and estimated the print to measure 21 inches long by 9 inches wide across the ball of the foot. It sank nearly 3 inches deep into the mud. This is a big boy, Jake said. I think this print's larger than the one Steve and I saw around my car. I don't think this is the same Bigfoot that guarded my car and made the bridge collapse. I think this Bigfoot's even bigger than that one. I think you're right, Bo said as he closely examined the footprints. The prints around your car were smaller. They continued to walk along the edge of the brook and follow Steve's and the Bigfoot's tracks until they were within 100 yards of the canyon opening. Brian held a finger up to his lips to signal Jake and Bo to be quiet. He waved them over to him as he moved behind a large pine tree. We're gonna have to be stealthy from this point forward to the canyon opening. This is the only way in or out of the canyon, and if the Bigfoot is on guard, it'll see us. Jake and Bo nodded their heads to let Brian know they understood. Brian pointed to another large pine tree about 10 feet away, and then held up 3 fingers to indicate they would make their way to the next tree on the count of 3. 1, 2, 3. They made their way in single file over behind the next pine tree and stopped behind it out of view of the canyon opening. Brian peeked around the tree to see if he could see the Bigfoot near the opening. Nothing. They repeated this same process 3 more times until they were within about 30 feet of the opening. They stopped this time behind a large oak tree. There's no more trees we can hide behind between here and the opening, Brian whispered. I suggest we run from here to the rock wall to the right of the opening and hold. Jake and Bo nodded their heads. Brian started the countdown with hand signals. 1, 2, 3. They ran in single file to the rock wall. They stood with their backs against the wall for a few seconds to catch their breath. Brian advanced toward the opening and leveled his .44 as he turned the corner and entered through it. Jake and Bo were right on his heels. It was fairly dark inside the canyon as Brian said it would be. They didn't notice any immediate sign of Steve or the Bigfoot. They did notice that their prints led directly to the canyon. Brian walked about 10 to 15 feet inside the canyon as he followed the right side of the brook that ran down the center of it. Jake noticed how the water cascaded down over the top of the 150-foot tall rock wall at the far end of the canyon. He assumed this was what fed the brook that ran through the canyon floor. He also suspected the water came from a source higher up in the mountains. They were careful while they looked underneath the rock ledges they passed while they made their way deeper into the canyon. There was no sign of Steve or the Bigfoot. They followed the tracks up to an oversized protrusion of rock that formed a small cave at the bottom of the canyon wall. The cave measured approximately 8 feet wide by 6 feet tall and 12 feet deep. They looked inside the cave and found the remainder of Steve's t-shirt. Only the collar, sleeves, and a few inches of fabric that would have covered his chest and back remained. On the ground along the right cave wall, Bo discovered a note written in the dirt. The note said, "Been here 2 days, 1 night. Bigfoot antsy. It guards openings so I can't leave. Brings me raw meat. Don't know if I will make it. I am sick and left leg injured. Tell family and Valerie I love them. Steve." The stick Steve used to write the message lay nearby. "Fuck," Jake said and asked, "Where do you think the Bigfoot took Steve from here?" Brian looked up and scanned the tops of the canyon walls. "The only other place I can think of is in one of the caves on either of these mountains." "Shit," Jake said. "That means this Bigfoot is part of a clan of the more aggressive creatures you told us about last night." "It seems that way," Brian said as he wiped sweat away from his brow. "We need to head back to the truck. We can take the road on into Braxton County and come out on the other side of this canyon in the mountains. We can hike the trails up into the mountains from the other side. This side is too steep to climb without the proper gear. There's no way we could climb it." Jake and Bo looked at each other, then they looked at Brian, and Jake said, "Come on, let's get going." When they arrived back at the Bronco, the clock said it was 10:39 a.m. They stowed the guns in the back end and headed off down the road into Braxton County. "It'll take about 25 minutes to make it around to the other side of the mountains," Brian said. "Once we get there, we should probably go ahead and eat our lunch before we head out again." Jake and Bo agreed. Bo said, "I can eat." "So can I," Jake said. They followed the dirt road around 3 more switchbacks before they found a place to pull off on the other side of the mountains. Brian pushed the button to unlock the tailgate, and they all hopped out and made their way to the back end of the truck. Jake pulled the tailgate open and Brian pulled the basket and cooler up to the edge of the tailgate and left them sit just inside the truck. Brian said, "Marissa said she packed us each a ham and Swiss cheese sandwich on her homemade Vienna rolls, along with more potato chips and an apple fritter for dessert." "That sounds great," Jake said. "Ham and Swiss are one of my favorites." Brian reached into the basket and pulled a sandwich, bag of chips, and a fritter out for each of them. Bo got each of them a cola from the cooler. Bo and Brian sat on the tailgate of the truck to eat while Jake stood and ate a few feet from them. "Which mountain do you recommend we begin our search?" Jake asked. "The mountain to our left," Brian said and explained. "There are several caves near the halfway point and a few more up on the ridge. If we don't find anything, we'll cross over to the other mountain and search there and make our way back down to the truck. The mountain on the right is where the cave is located where the miners found their gold. A few more yards down the road is where the Bigfoot grabbed the lady's dog I told you about last night. Why would she walk her dog out here in the middle of nowhere?" Bo asked. "She lives in a house a little farther on up the road that sits quite a distance back inside the trees," Brian said as he pointed up the road. "You can't see her house from here." They finished up their lunch, and like yesterday, Bo did the dishes. He rounded up all their garbage and placed it in a bag and set it back in the back end of the truck. They picked up their weapons and headed out. Brian also grabbed the flashlight before he closed the tailgate of the truck. "There's a trailhead about 1/8 of a mile back down the road," Brian said as he led the way. "That's where we'll start." Jake and Bo followed Brian to the trailhead and walked back inside the tree line. "Remember what I told you guys last night about the creatures here?" Brian said. "Remember, they're super aggressive, so stay alert at all times." Jake said, "Don't worry." Bo said, "I wish I had eyes in the back of my head like my 4th grade teacher, Mrs. Crutchsky, did." The trail split in 2 directions a few yards from where they entered the tree line. One trail led to the left and the other to the right. The one on the left ascended skyward. The one on the right followed along the bottom of the mountain inside the tree line until it disappeared around a curve and out of sight. They chose the trail on the left. The woods were extremely thick and the light from the sun barely reached the forest floor. They could only see small patches of sunlight here and there along their way. The trail ascended the mountain at a 40-degree angle, and this made their climb a little more difficult. They stopped to catch their breath and rest for a few minutes after they climbed about 200 yards. At that point, they were about a third of the way up the mountain. "Where do these offshoots lead?" Jake asked. Brian said, "Most of the offshoots more than likely lead to a dead end." They continued on after they caught their breath. They climbed another 50 yards before the main trail turned and switched back in the opposite direction. About 30 feet beyond the curve was an opening to a cave that was formed by rocks that jutted out of the side of the mountain. They walked up to the cave. Bo leveled the shotgun and stepped in front of the cave opening while Brian shined the flashlight inside it. Nothing. Jake noticed the cave was of medium size. It measured about 10 feet wide by 5 feet tall and about 15 feet deep. The cave opening was slightly narrower. Brian walked inside the cave and looked around for any sign of Steve or the Bigfoot. He came back out and said, "I didn't find anything." Jake asked, "Does it look like anything at all has been staying in there?" "Not really," Brian said. "If something was, it left a long time ago." Bo said, "When we check these caves out, we also need to be aware of mountain lions. I've heard they'll take up residence inside caves like." These sometimes. What about bears? Jake asked. Yeah, bears will too, Brian said. It's late spring, so they're not hibernating anymore. We shouldn't have to worry too much about them. They continued on up the trail for another 75 yards before it led around another curve and switched back to the left and headed in the opposite direction. This must be where several of the larger caves start along this leg of the trail, Brian whispered. From here, we definitely need to stay quiet and alert while we approach these caves because I suspect these caves are where some of the creatures live. It's along this stretch of the trail where the day hikers went missing. The one hiker's shredded and blood-encrusted jacket was found near the top of the ridgeline alongside the trail up there. Jake and Bo nodded to confirm their understanding. They approached the first of several larger caves that Brian had told them about. Jake leveled the 30-30 and walked in front of the cave opening. Brian walked up beside him and shined the flashlight inside the cave. Again, nothing. This cave measured roughly 15 feet wide by 10 feet tall and 30 feet deep. The cave opening was relative in size to the cave's inner dimensions. Brian stepped inside the cave to explore it and came back out a short time later. When he exited the cave, he wore his shirt collar over the top of his nose and his eyes were watering. He lowered his shirt collar and used his shirt tails to wipe his eyes. The farther I got back inside the cave, I smelled a sickening putrid odor, Brian whispered and explained. It smelled like a cross between a wet dog and a rotten animal scent. One or more creatures must have been in this cave recently for the odor to linger like it is. I looked around and didn't notice anything other than a few scuff marks in the dirt near the back wall of the cave. That's what the nest smelled like in the barn and pig pen that me and Steve found. There was also a smell of something that smelled like sulfur mixed with the odor that came from the one in the pig pen. It does stink, Jake whispered. They continued for another 50 feet on up the trail to the next cave that jutted out of the mountainside and was located on the right side of the trail. They heard deep breathing and snoring sounds come from inside this cave as they approached it. They approached with extreme caution. Brian waved Jake and Bo up to the right of the cave entrance. They all paused to hear the breathing sounds. The breathing was deep and rhythmical and sounded like one or two creatures might be inside the cave asleep. Without turning on the flashlight, Brian quickly peeked around the corner of the cave opening, but he couldn't see anything because the cave was extremely dark inside. They stood outside the opening for a few minutes and continued to listen to the breathing that came from inside the cave. Brian whispered, "I'm gonna quickly peek back around the corner of the opening and flash my light on and off." Jake and Bo nodded. Brian drew his .44 in his right hand and held the flashlight in his left. Jake and Bo leveled their weapons just in case. Brian whispered, "Are you two ready?" Jake and Bo nodded. Brian quickly peeked around the corner of the cave opening and quickly flashed his light. "There are two creatures laying in there asleep," Brian whispered when he stepped back away from the cave opening. "They're lying near the middle of the cave. Did you see any sign of Steve?" Jake whispered. Brian shook his head no. He waved for Jake and Bo to follow him past the entrance as he quietly walked in front of it. Once on the other side of the cave entrance, about 20 feet on up the trail, they stopped. "We really need to stay as quiet as possible," Brian whispered. "I suspect there will be other creatures sleeping in these caves. We don't need to wake them up and start a battle." Jake and Bo nodded. They cautiously and quietly approached the next cave entrance. They didn't hear any noise come from inside this cave, so Brian leveled his .44 and stepped in front of the cave opening and shined his flashlight inside. Nothing. Jake noticed this cave measured 5 feet wide by about 5 feet tall and 10 feet deep. This one was a little smaller than all of the previous caves, judging from its opening. Jake thought, the dimensions of this cave is perfect for a single Bigfoot to take refuge in so it can hide and sleep throughout the day. They decided to rest in front of this cave opening for a few minutes before they made their way on up to the ridgeline. The top of the ridgeline lay approximately 125 yards on up the trail. From where they stood, Jake could see 3 separate rock formations, and he assumed the caves were located inside or underneath them. The formations looked evenly spaced across the top of the ridgeline. Looking through the thin trees along the top of the ridge, the formations sat about 100 yards apart. A giant oak tree stood to the right of the center rock formation. Its canopy rose well above the tops of the pine trees that stood next to it. After their short break, they carefully and quietly made their way to the top of the ridgeline. The first rock formation and cave was 40 feet ahead on the trail. They approached the opening like they had the others. The opening of this cave faced Dead Miner's Gulch. Jake suspected the other two caves faced north as well. The forest floor in this area was nothing but rock, and it led to the top of the canyon wall. He watched as a moderate amount of water trickled out of this cave and made its way across the rock and disappeared over the side of the mountain. He suspected this was the source of the water that cascaded down over the back wall of the canyon and formed the small brook below. He also suspected that a natural spring inside the cave was where the water came from. He thought, this is a perfect water source for the creatures that live in and among these caves. Other than the sound of the trickle of the water, they didn't hear any other noise that came from inside the cave. Brian stepped in front of the cave opening and shined his flashlight inside while Bo stood ready with the shotgun. At first I thought I saw a Bigfoot lying against the wall on the left side of the cave asleep, Brian whispered. But now that I've thought about it, it's a nest. Brian walked inside the cave to take a closer look. When he exited the cave, he reported, "It is indeed a nest made from old pine boughs and branches, and it has an odor similar to what I smelled inside the other cave permeating it. There was no sign of Steve in this cave either. There's a natural spring that flows from the back wall of this cave." This confirmed Jake's suspicion about the water source. They continued on to the center cave of the rock formation. They stopped just outside the cave to listen for any noise that might come from inside it. Everything was quiet. Like before, Bo readied the shotgun as Brian shined his light inside the cave. Again, nothing. This cave was moderately sized. It measured approximately 40 feet wide by 8.5 to 9 feet tall and about 30 to 35 feet deep. Jake thought to himself, this cave could easily house two separate Bigfoot families that consist of 4 members, each with plenty of room to spare. Brian walked inside the cave and came back out a short time later. It doesn't look like anything has been inside this cave for quite some time. I wonder why. Jake asked and said, this cave is huge. They made their way to the last cave on the top of the ridgeline. The opening to this cave was located on the far side of the rock formation and faced due west, unlike the openings of the first 2 caves. Because the time was around 3:30 p.m., the sun was far enough to the west it shined a few feet into the cave opening. They stopped approximately 4 feet from the left of the cave opening. They listened for any noises that might come from inside the cave. They heard faint breathing sounds that came from what they believed were multiple creatures inside. An extremely strong putrid stench emanated from the cave on the wind. Brian whispered, "This is the same smell that was in the other cave, except for the sulfur smell mixed into this one." The odor was so strong that Jake almost gagged. He cut the gag off and lifted his t-shirt collar over his nose. Bo and Brian did the same. They continued to stand there and listen for a few more minutes. At one point, they heard a crunch sound along with a couple of grunts. Brian whispered, "It sure sounds like there's a lot of creatures inside this one." Jake and Bo nodded. Brian whispered, "I'm gonna do what I did at the other cave. I'm gonna peek around the corner to see how far I can see inside and then flash my light." Jake and Bo nodded. Brian whispered, "I want you guys to both stand with your weapons at the ready when I shine my light inside." Jake and Bo nodded. Brian leveled his .44 and prepared himself to step in front of the cave opening on the count of 3. Jake and Bo prepared themselves to step past Brian so they would have a clear shot should one or more of the creatures charge at them from out of the cave. Brian signaled and started the countdown. 1, 2, 3. Brian peeked around the corner of the cave into the darkness. Jake and Bo stepped past him with their weapons leveled and pointed them inside the cave. Brian flashed his light. For a brief second, they all saw 7 or 8 creatures that lay on the floor of the cave asleep. To be sure Steve wasn't among them, Brian flashed his light again. In those 2 brief seconds, Jake didn't notice Steve inside the cave with the creatures. He, along with Brian and Bo, did notice a creature sitting upright and glaring at them the second time Brian flashed his light. ducked back to the left of the cave opening and held their breath while they listened for any movement or noise inside the cave that indicated. The Bigfoot had actually seen them. They heard 2 more loud grunts and what sounded like 1 or 2 creatures get to their feet. Brian quickly glanced at Jake and Bo and yelled, "Run!" Brian took off and ran past the cave opening and began to make his way down the mountainside through the trees and dense underbrush. Jake and Bo quickly followed him. Jake caught movement out of the corner of his left eye when he and Bo ran past the cave opening. 2 creatures moved toward the cave opening. Just as Jake made his way around the end of the rock formation to haul ass down the mountainside, one of the creatures charged out of the cave opening and looked in his direction and saw him and roared. A second creature appeared beside the first. It sounded like all hell broke loose inside the cave at this point. It sounded like all the creatures inside the cave got to their feet. Jake heard the thump of the soles of their padded feet and several grunts and growls come from the cave opening. The Bigfoot that roared at him gave chase along with the second Bigfoot trailing close behind the first one. Jake took off down the mountainside and followed Bo and Brian. Brian led the way. He was already down to where the trail switched back to the east. Jake looked toward the cave on that stretch of the trail and noticed another Bigfoot that stood outside the cave where they saw the 2 that were asleep earlier. This Bigfoot threw its head back and howled. It took off and ran diagonally toward Brian to cut off his path. Brian yelled, "I'll shoot that one if you guys shoot the ones behind us." Brian stopped dead in his tracks and leveled his .44 and fired 3 successive rounds at the Bigfoot that ran toward him. All 3 hollow points hit the Bigfoot in the dead center of its chest from nearly 20 yards away. They saw blood and tissue fly from the Bigfoot when the bullets entered its chest. The Bigfoot instantly dropped dead. Bo turned around and leveled the shotgun and pointed it at the Bigfoot that led the way behind them. "I'll shoot the one in front. You get the one behind it," he yelled. "You got it," Jake yelled as he dived to the ground and turned to face uphill so he could keep his eyes on both creatures. Bo pulled the trigger but missed the Bigfoot. This pissed both creatures off even more. The lead Bigfoot bared its teeth and growled. The Bigfoot behind the lead one howled as it continued down the mountainside. Bo took more careful aim and shot the lead Bigfoot in the abdomen. It dropped to its knees and clutched its belly and withered in agony. It fell onto its back and shrieked. The second Bigfoot hurtled over the top of the first one and continued its pursuit. It was only 15 yards away from Jake, and it ran even faster at this point. Jake quickly jumped to his feet and took careful aim at the second Bigfoot and pulled the trigger. The bullet from the .30 hit the Bigfoot and entered into its right eye socket. The Bigfoot dropped instantly. Jake quickly looked back up the mountainside toward the cave where all of the creatures had been asleep and noticed 3 more were in hot pursuit. They bounded down the mountainside. 2 of them ran on all 4s while the third ran upright. Bo yelled for Jake to run as he again took off down the mountain. Everything moved in slow motion for Jake. He heard Bo yell for him to run, but it seemed like he couldn't get his feet in gear. He was frozen in place. One of the creatures that raced down the mountain toward him let loose with another howl. The howl transported Jake back into reality. He quickly turned around and ran. About 1/3 of the mountain remained before they would break out of the trees and into the road. As Jake continued down the mountainside, he noticed Brian and Bo had stopped and aimed their weapons in his direction. Jake felt the footsteps of the creatures through the ground as they gained on him. He knew the creatures were only a few yards behind him.
Bo scrimed, duck.
Jake dived face first into the dirt. He knew what was going to happen. He heard 5 shots ring out in rapid succession. He heard 2 of the creatures hit the ground behind him. He knew the other one was closing fast. He rolled over onto his back and raised the barrel of the .30 just as the Bigfoot crouched down to get ready to leap on top of him. He cocked the rifle and fired off 1 round just as the Bigfoot made its move. Jake hit the Bigfoot in the dead center of its collarbone. The Bigfoot was so close to him that he could hear the sound of the bones shatter as the bullet went through the front of its collarbone. He watched as blood and tissue exited out of the back of the base of its head. The bullet severed the Bigfoot's spinal column at the base of its brain. It landed about 2 feet from him and twitched at his feet. Its right hand touched the toe of his left shoe. The Bigfoot took its final breath a few seconds later. Jake quickly jumped to his feet and ran down the mountain as quickly as he could to join Brian and Bo. There was no sign of any more creatures pursuing them at the moment, but they figured there were. At least a few more near the cave, opening on the hillside above them. They quickly made their way out of the tree line and ran down the road to Brian's truck. Brian had his keys in his hand and was ready to unlock the driver's side door when he reached it. Brian quickly unlocked his door and rapidly hit the button to unlock the passenger side. Jake opened the door and Bo dived into the back seat. Jake hurriedly climbed into the front seat and closed and locked his door while Brian started the truck. Brian put the truck into gear and they sped off down the road. They were all trying to catch their breath and talk at the same time. Brian shouted, "I want to get to a place where I can turn the truck around. I don't want the other creatures to attack us." Bo yelled, "That was close. That was close. Great God Almighty, that was close. Get us the fuck out of here," Jake hollered. Brian drove a half-mile up the road before he turned the Bronco around. At this point, they had started to catch their breath and calm down. "That's it for today," Brian said as he breathed heavily. "We're going home.
We'll come back and check the caves on the other mountain.
Tomorrow, but if we don't find Steve, we're gonna have to assume the worst and call off our search. Maybe we should wait a couple days to come back and search the other mountain," Bo said. "Let's give the creatures some time to cool off first." Brian said, "I'm sure the creatures on the other mountain, including the one that has Steve, heard the shots being fired as we killed, what, a total of 6 creatures today. The battle we all just went through may have scared the Bigfoot that has Steve, and it might take him somewhere else," Jake said. "If Steve and the Bigfoot are even on the other mountain at all, we need to come back tomorrow and rescue Steve before things have a chance to settle down." "Yeah, you're probably right," Bo said. "After thinking about it, if we wait too long, the Bigfoot that has Steve will probably take him somewhere else. If that happens, we might never find him. Also, the more time that Steve is out there exposed to the elements, the worse shape he'll be in," Jake said. "Even if he survives this ordeal at all. Remember Brian told us how the faster we find him, the greater the chance of his survival." "Yeah," Bo said. "I guess we'll pick up our search again tomorrow." When they approached the straightaway in the road at the bottom of the 2 mountains where they just won their battle with 6 creatures, none of the other creatures stood in their way. Brian saw it was all clear and gunned the engine as they made their way back out of Braxton County and headed toward home. They pulled into Brian's driveway about an hour later. The clock on the truck's dash indicated it was 4:44 p.m. Marissa sat on the porch reading a book, and Jeannie leaped off the porch to greet them when they exited the Bronco. Jeannie flew past Brian and ran up to Jake and smelled his sweatpants. Jake figured she smelled the repulsive scent of the creatures on him. She barked and wagged her tail when he bent down to pet her. Bo climbed out of the back seat and Jeannie greeted him in like fashion. "Unload your weapons and put them back into the back of the Bronco. There's no use to take them inside because we'll need them again tomorrow," Brian said as he handed the flashlight to Bo. "I'll take my .44 with me in case we might need it later." Brian headed to the porch to join Marissa. Bo and Jake unloaded and stowed their weapons along with the flashlight back inside the back end of the Bronco. Bo grabbed the garbage bag and picnic basket while Jake grabbed the cooler and closed the tailgate. They made their way over to and upon the porch. Jake noticed Marissa had her .357 Magnum lying on the bench beside her. Apparently, Brian noticed this as well and asked, "Why do you have your pistol out here with you?" Marissa said, "I heard several tree knocks and whistles come from both ends of the property, both in front and behind the cabin inside the tree line since I came out here to sit down and read my book." "Do the knocks and whistles sound like they're getting closer?" Brian asked. "They did at one point," Marissa said as she turned her book upside down and laid it in her lap, "but then they sounded like they moved farther away." They all heard a loud tree knock ring out from inside the tree line 125 yards away on the other side of the driveway in front of the house, just as Marissa finished her comment. Bo said, "I sure hope we don't have to kill any more creatures today." "How many have you guys already killed?" Marissa asked. "All in all," Brian said as he looked toward the tree line where the knock originated from, "we killed a total of 6 of those bastards today. One of them almost got a hold of Jake. I killed the one closest to Jake while Brian killed the other one," Bo said. "Jake took the one out that nearly leaped on top of him." "You guys sure are lucky," Marissa said and asked, Did you guys find any more signs of Steve? We searched the canyon first and found a note Steve wrote in the dirt in the last cave we checked, Brian said as he sat down on the bench next to Marissa. The note said he had been in that location for 2 days and 1 night. Steve wrote the Bigfoot is antsy and brought him raw meat to eat. He asked us to tell his family and girlfriend he loved them. Steve's note makes me think he thinks he won't make it out alive. That's sad, Marissa said as she looked at all of them with tears in her eyes. I can't even begin to imagine what he's going through. Brian explained to Marissa their entire exploit in full detail. Are you guys going to resume your hunt again tomorrow? Marissa asked. Yeah, Brian said. We're gonna make one last attempt. If we don't find Steve tomorrow, I don't know where else to search. We'll have to assume the worst and end our search entirely. I really wish you would go ahead and call off your search after what you guys have already been through, Marissa said, her mouth set in a hard line. Eyes narrowed and arms crossed. One or all of you are going to get killed. I know that you're close to finding Steve, and I hope more than anything that you do, but I don't want to see any of you get killed in the process. Don't worry, Brian said, his legs crossed with hands clasped behind his head. We'll be extremely careful. Bo and Jake made their way into the cabin to put the basket and cooler on the kitchen island. They washed up in the kitchen sink. Marissa shouted, I washed and folded all of your laundry. I put all of it on the bed upstairs. Thank you, Jake shouted. Since Brian and Marissa told Bo and Jake to make themselves at home, they helped themselves to a glass of iced tea and then walked back out to the porch. They sat down in the rocking chairs and Jeannie walked over and laid down at Bo's feet. Bo sat his drink down and leaned forward to pet her.
Jake lit à cigarette.
Brian must have gone into the cabin at some point while Bo and Jake were inside because he reappeared a short time later with a beer. He walked back out to the porch and sat back down next to Marissa. Marissa asked, Would you like a leftover meatball sandwich and salad for dinner? That sounds great, Jake said. Bo said, That sounds good. Jeannie barked. Brian said, There couldn't be too many meatballs left because you gave Jeannie 5 of them last night. I made 6 dozen of them, Marissa said, her arms crossed, eyes narrowed. There's plenty for all of us to each have a sandwich and more. Then enough for Jeannie to have some more for her dinner tonight. Jeannie looked at Marissa and barked again. I'll head into the kitchen too. Get dinner started around 6 o'clock, and it should be ready by 7 o'clock. All of them, including Jeannie, sat on the porch in silence for the next hour or so. Jake assumed they were all reflecting on the events that had transpired earlier that day. Marissa returned to her book. From what Jake could tell from the book's cover, she was reading some type of romance novel. Jeannie also enjoyed the silence because she snored at Bo's feet. Marissa stood up and closed and put her book down on the bench. She walked back inside the cabin. Jake assumed it was to start dinner. After Marissa went back inside, Brian leaned forward and turned to look at Bo and Jake and said, We should probably get an early start tomorrow just like we did today. We should leave here around 5:30 if we're gonna be at the base of that mountain when the sun comes up. Bo and Jake nodded. This meant they would have to get up a half hour earlier than they did this morning. Jake had no problem with that. I guess we'll be getting up well before the roosters, Bo said, looking directly at Brian, his eyebrows raised. I don't have any problem with that. I have to get up early because I have to be at my dad's shop by 6:30 every morning. Brian asked, What type of vehicles do you and your dad work on? Just about anything that comes into the shop, Bo said as he looked to his left. My dad complains about some of the foreign models because it's sometimes difficult to get parts. Brian asked, Besides your wrecked truck, do you own any other vehicles? I have a dark red 1977 Honda-Matic 750A motorcycle and a teal green 1964 Ford Mustang convertible. I bought and rebuilt both of them myself. That's great, Brian said and frowned. I wish I knew how to do mechanical work on cars. I always have to take mine in for any type of repairs. If we ever make it back to civilization, you can bring your Bronco to the shop and I'll look it over and make any necessary repairs free of charge. It's the least I can do, Bo said and smiled. You don't have to do that. I'll pay. Nonsense. After all you and Marissa have done for me and Jake, call it a done deal. Okay, I won't argue. Marissa shouted, Dinner's ready. They all got up and walked inside the cabin. Jeannie led the way. They walked into the kitchen and Marissa said, "You can refill your glasses on your way to the dining room." Jake and Bo set the glasses down on the counter and washed up in the kitchen sink. They refilled their glasses on the way to the dining room. They walked into the dining room and sat down in the same seats they sat in the night before. Jeannie lay in her usual spot. Marissa had already placed everything on the table. Bowls filled with salad sat on the table next to each of their plates. A Vienna roll sat atop each plate. A bowl of freshly grated Parmesan cheese and a saucer filled with both Swiss and mozzarella cheeses sat in the middle of the table on either side of a large bowl of steaming meatballs. Everything looked and smelled delicious. Brian looked directly across the table at Bo. "Go ahead and help yourself." Bo picked up the bowl of meatballs and placed 2 of them on his plate before he passed them to Jake. Brian passed Bo the bowl of Parmesan cheese and the saucer of cheeses. Bo sat the bowl and saucer down next to his plate so he could cut his Vienna roll open and cut the meatballs up on his plate before he placed them on his bun. Bo sprinkled some Parmesan cheese over the top of his meatballs and laid a slice of both cheeses over the top of it after he put the sliced meatballs on his bun. He put the top back on his bun and smashed the sandwich together with his hand. He passed the bowl and saucer of cheeses to Jake, and he did the same. Jake passed everything to Marissa, who in turn passed everything to Brian. Once everyone was ready, Brian asked Bo, "Will you again do us the honor and say grace?" Bo prayed, "Father, we thank thee for this food. Bless the nourishments of our bodies. Bless this home and each one who surrounds this table, dear Lord. Please protect and watch over Steve and lead us to him in his most desperate hour of need, dear Lord. Please protect Brian, Jake, and me from the creatures as we continue our search for Steve again tomorrow. Please watch over Marissa and put her mind at ease so she won't worry about us. Also, please watch over and protect Jeannie and thank you for guiding her to us, dear Lord. Father, I ask this prayer in Jesus' name. Amen." Amen was heard all around the table. Jeannie barked once. After dinner was finished, Jake excused himself from the table so he could go back out to the porch to smoke. Jeannie got up and followed Jake, but Marissa called her back into the kitchen. Jake once again offered to help Marissa clear the table and do the dishes before he went outside. She declined his offer. Jake walked out to the porch with his iced tea in hand and sat down and lit up a cigarette. He had only taken 2 drags when a loud whistle emanated from just on the other side of Brian's Bronco. He looked in that direction but couldn't see anything because of the darkness. He got up and opened the screen door and flipped the switch to turn the porch light on. He again looked toward Brian's truck, and there was a Bigfoot standing on the other side of it. The porch light illuminated its big red eyes. It towered over the top of the truck and looked directly at Jake. Jake thought to himself, "This one looks like the one that guarded and more than likely destroyed my car." The Bigfoot stood at least 9 feet tall and was covered with black hair. He could only see the upper third of its body above the roof of the Bronco. Jake slowly backed up toward the screen door. The Bigfoot took one giant step toward the front of the truck and turned and bared its teeth at Jake. Jake looked to his right and noticed Marissa's .357 still sat on the bench next to her book. He quickly picked the gun up and removed it from its holster. The Bigfoot took another menacing step toward Jake while he struggled with the gun's safety mechanism. Jake was convinced he had finally unlocked the safety, and he leveled the gun and took careful aim at the Bigfoot's head. The Bigfoot now only stood about 15 feet from the porch. Jake squeezed the trigger and a single shot rang out. He opened his eyes and saw he had missed the Bigfoot. The bullet hit a tree trunk several feet to the left of the Bigfoot. He saw bark fly from the tree. The Bigfoot advanced straight toward him. Everyone inside the house heard the gun go off and ran to the door. Brian made it to the door first and saw the Bigfoot advance yet again. Marissa saw it and screamed, "Shoot it! Shoot it!" Jake again took careful aim. He kept his eyes open and pulled the trigger. This time the bullet found its mark. He shot the Bigfoot directly between the eyes. It dropped dead about 5 feet from the edge of the porch. Brian, Marissa, Bo, and Jeannie walked out onto the porch. Brian said, "That's the second time today that one of those bastards almost got you." "I know," Jake said wide-eyed, breathing heavily. "I'm thankful Marissa left her gun out here because I'm sure it would have gotten me before I could have gotten back inside the cabin and closed the door. Did you see how big that damn thing is?" Everyone replied with a resounding yes. I suspect this Bigfoot is the one who guarded my car and is also the one that destroyed it, Jake said. I can almost guarantee that for certain. Jeannie ran down off the porch and sniffed around the dead Bigfoot's body. While she sniffed the thing, trapped air from inside its lungs escaped through its nose and mouth, and it made a loud, raspy growling sound. Jeannie yelped and leaped back up on the porch with her tail tucked between her legs and hid behind Jake and trembled. Jake turned around and kneeled down and talked to her while he petted her. That seemed to calm her down. Jake stood back up and watched her as she made her way back off the porch and back over to the dead Bigfoot. Everyone watched as she squatted over the Bigfoot's right shoulder and peed. Everyone laughed. Brian said, "We're gonna have to try to drag that motherfucker off so the other creatures won't come close to the cabin to retrieve it. We can wrap a chain around the Bigfoot's ankles and tow it over into the middle of the White's property and leave it there." "That sounds like a good idea," Bo said. Jake said, "Yeah, we don't need any more monsters showing up." "How much do you think that thing weighs?" Bo asked. Brian sized the Bigfoot up and said, "Probably close to 800 pounds. "It looks like it might weigh even more than that," Jake said. "That's one big motherfucker." Brian said, "You guys wait on the porch while I go down to the basement and get a chain." Jake put Marissa's gun back in its holster and snapped it closed. "Don't forget to put 2 more bullets in it so it'll be fully loaded," he said as he handed the gun back to Marissa. "I won't forget." Marissa took the gun from Jake, and she and Jeannie went back inside the cabin. Brian arrived back on the porch a short time later. He carried his .44, a 50 feet long, 5,000-pound tow-weight chain, and a flashlight. "Come on, guys," Brian said as he stepped off the porch. "Help me get this fucker chained up and then hooked to the truck. Wrap and secure the chain around its ankles." He handed the chain to Bo and Jake and said, "I'm gonna go and turn the truck around in the driveway and pull up alongside it so we can hook the other end of the chain to the hitch." Bo and Jake hogtied the chain around the Bigfoot's ankles. They had to lift each of its lower legs individually so they could wrap the chain around them. Its legs were too heavy to lift both of them at once. It lay face down in the yard. Jake grasped its right ankle and bent its massive lower leg toward its butt and held onto it while Bo wrapped a 6 feet length of chain around it. They wrapped its left ankle in the same fashion. Once they had both of its ankles wrapped in the chain, Jake struggled to lift both ankles off the ground while Bo wrapped the chain around both of them. Bo wrapped the chain 4 times around both of its ankles and then fed the other end of the chain back down through the middle. The Bigfoot was now fully hogtied above its feet. "God, that thing reeks," Jake said. "It sure the hell does," Bo said. "I wonder why they smell so bad?" Bo asked while he gagged severely. "Are you gonna be all right, man?" Jake asked and said, "Look at them. They're covered in hair and sweat and probably never bathe. You know how bad a dog smells when it hasn't been bathed in a while."
Bo vomited.
"Are you all right?" Jake asked. "Yeah, that smell is just too overwhelming." Brian pulled up beside the Bigfoot, connect the other end of the chain to the hitch on the back of the truck. Bo secured it to the hitch, and then he and Jake both got inside the truck with Brian. Brian put the truck into gear and slowly moved through the grass down the right side of the driveway. Once the length of chain between the hitch and the Bigfoot was pulled taut, Brian had to gun the engine to move the Bigfoot. He pulled up to the road and turned right and drove toward the first river crossing. Brian turned left onto the old dirt road just before the river crossing. They followed the road that cut through the White's property for about a half mile before Brian stopped. Brian put the Bronco in park, and they all got out. Bo disconnected the chain from the hitch, while Jake unwrapped the chain from around the Bigfoot's ankles. Brian held his .44 and the flashlight. He shined the light on the back of the Bigfoot's head and said, "Wow, that .357 sure does pack a wallop." There's not much left of the back of the Bigfoot's head. Jake stopped and looked at the exit wound on the back of the Bigfoot's head and noticed a hole about the size of a medium-sized cantaloupe. "I guess that's what a .357 hollow point bullet will do to you," Jake said. "I guess so," Brian said and then laughed. Brian pushed the button to open tailgate. Jake finally got the chain unwrapped from around the Bigfoot's ankles and put the chain back inside the back end and closed the tailgate. They all climbed back into the Bronco and Brian drove back to the cabin. "Thank you guys for your help," Brian said. "I would not have been able to do that by myself." "No problem," Jake said. Brian said, "I'm sure glad that Bigfoot didn't show up while Marissa sat outside reading her book. Jeannie would have given her plenty of warning," Jake said as they pulled back into the driveway. "After all we've been through today, I'm gonna go in and get cleaned up and turn in for the night." Jake made his way inside the cabin and said, "Good night," as he passed through the great room where Marissa sat in one of the log chairs in front of the fireplace reading her book. Jeannie lay on the floor beside her. Marissa said, "Good night. I'll see you in the morning." Jake made his way upstairs to the bathroom. He quickly washed up in the sink and then went into the bedroom to get ready to lay down and go to sleep. When he walked into the bedroom and turned on the light, he saw his and Bo's clean clothes folded into two neat piles laying on the bed. He forgot that Marissa had done their laundry for them. He picked up his pile of clothes and sat them on the small wooden chair on the wall opposite the bed next to the chest. Then he picked up Bo's clothes and set them on the wingback chair that sat in the corner. He next folded the duffel bags and set them on top of the writing desk. He walked back around to his side of the bed and stripped down to his underwear and crawled into the bed and turned the lamp off. He turned onto his right side to face the window to go to sleep. Before he fell asleep, Jake heard Bo go into the bathroom to get cleaned up. He next heard him make his way into the bedroom and fumble through the dark to his side of the bed. Bo left the bedroom door open, by way of the light that came into the room from the loft. Jake watched Bo strip everything off and climb into bed and lay down and cover up. Jake drifted off to sleep soon thereafter. Please tune in next week as we continue on with the next installment of A Journey Through Hell and Back. For those who cannot wait, this title is available on Amazon.com. A link to the book is available in the description below the video. Please remember to like and subscribe so you won't miss out on the continuing saga.